Hello, everyone. A really good evening, and it's really nice to see all of you here. Thank you so much for coming. A really, really warm welcome. My name is Lin, Professor Lin Ang. I am the Product and Vice Dean Research here at the Institute of Education at UCL, and I'm delighted to be hosting and chairing this event, this very important seminal inaugural lecture for Professor Alice Bradbury. Now, I'm delighted to be able to welcome all of you, but also to introduce this seminal lecture, Schools, Policy, and Inequality, researching why teachers do what they do and what it means for children. And I have to say, I've known Alice for some time now. It's a real delight and an honor to be here, to be chairing and introducing her lecture. And of course, many of you here will know our eminent speaker for today, Professor Alice Bradbury, is a professor of sociology of education. She is also the co-director of the Helen Hamlin Center for Pedagogy, a flagship center that we are delighted to host here at IOE UCL. Alice's research, I should say, very much illuminates that intersection and that interaction of policy, practice, and inequalities. That's those so important formative categories in terms of class, gender, and race. And focus, importantly, and this is where it lies at the heart of my passion as well, the early years and primary education. And I know Alice's research very well, and indeed, I have cited her research often, as I'm sure many of you here have. And her research is absolutely seminal because it's played a really pivotal role in making education absolute at the highest policy agenda for younger children and a real focus in the field of sociology in education. And in particular, Alice has examined the nature and impact of testing on pupils, and we know that in itself is a controversy and a really important debate to have, from the reception baseline assessment to sets. And also, of course, closely linked to her work on this is that datification of education. More recently, Alice has researched in early years and primary education, both during the COVID pandemic. You know, we often forget what it's like, but it's still around us. And I think in education, we are certainly seeing the ramifications of it, that long-lasting effect on children, including that contributing on two major projects that Alice has done, funded by the ESRC, and on the subsequent cost of living crisis. Now, importantly, I think all that work highlights the important role that schools play in relation to family and community well-being, something that I think is absolutely crucial currently, especially in the current climate, and particularly in matters related to school funding and accountability frameworks. And of course, notably, in Alice's work it has been very much about that close engagement on the front line of education policy and practice, much needed now than ever before. And this has been well recognized nationally and internationally, of course, by the Beira Sage Impact Award, and most recently reflected in Alice's co-chairing of the Independent Commission on Primary Education and her work with the Beyond Ofsted Inquiry. I won't say any more. I think Alice's achievements and very illustrious career speaks for itself, but I'm just delighted to introduce my colleague, my dear colleague, Professor Alice Bradbury, to give her seminal presentation. Thank you, Alice. Over to you.
Right, good evening, everyone. And first of all, thank you for coming to this event. It's great to see everyone here. Thank you for bearing with us while we reorganise this after the postponement in November. I hope it's worth the wait. I want to start by thanking the IOE events team for organising this event twice over, and obviously Lynn for her very kind introduction. I also want to say thank you in advance to Carol for being the respondent. I'm really delighted she's here to speak today because she has been incredibly supportive over the last 15 years or so. I'm also glad she agreed because knowing Carol, she would definitely say something nice. It will be very insightful, I'm sure, but I know I feel in safe hands. So in preparation for this lecture, I have been watching various previous IOE professorial lectures available on the website if you're interested. And I've been kind of learning how to do this. And from this study, I found out it's customary to include some kind of backstory about your kind of path to becoming a professor. And through this process, I've discovered two things. First of all, that people have really interesting backstories, very inspiring and interesting paths into academia. And second, I've realised that my backstory is really rather boring in comparison. But I'm going to tell it to you anyway, so you'll be glad to hear, before I get into the kind of main part of the lecture. So I'm going to combine it, though, with saying thank you to some key people who have been really instrumental in getting me to this point. I've got some personal thank yous at the end, but I thought that this strategy might allow me to mention some of the key people who have kind of helped me professionally along the way, while also giving those of you who don't know me an insight into my rather standard backstory. So, like all good stories, we're going to start in the middle with my first experiences of IOE, which was 20 years ago. Back in 2005, I embarked on a master's degree part-time in social justice and education. I started the MA. I was teaching in a primary school in King's Cross, not far from here, and I had a pretty traumatic first year as a newly qualified teacher, and I was already really having doubts about whether I could possibly do this job for the next few years, let alone the next 40. There were some key things about education that were beginning to concern me, and doing the MA really opened my eyes to engage critically with some of the everyday practices which I was seeing in school. So my first thank yous are to Tony Green and Eva Gmarnikoff, who ran the MA at the time, and really started my journey into the sociology of education. The next person was one who really changed my life, however. So I did the module on sociology of race and education, which had been started by David Gilbourne, but was taught that year by Deborah Udell. Dave was on sabbatical, and I found this module really fascinating, given that I'd worked in a school which was overwhelmingly made up of ethnic minority children. I went on to do my dissertation on race and class inequality. Deborah was my tutor, and during one meeting, she just said offhandedly, "Oh, you could do a PhD on this." And due to that one comment, my life took a completely different turn. I hadn't really thought about what to do next at all, other than teaching, and suddenly this different kind of path opened up to me, and one which I felt I might be a bit better suited. So by this point, I'd moved schools. I was teaching year 6 in Bethnal Green, and I found myself a bit disillusioned with a job where what really matters was not how much the children learnt or how good my relationship was with them, but what they got in their SATs. So I took the plunge. I applied to do a PhD full-time. I was lucky enough to get funding from the ESRC for 3 years, and Deborah became my supervisor alongside Dave Gilbourne and also Michael Apple from the University of Madison, Wisconsin. And I am, of course, very grateful to them for all the support they gave me during my PhD and since, guiding me into an academic career and providing insightful advice all along the way. I'm going to talk a bit more, obviously, about my PhD research in a bit, but during this period, I also met many fellow PhD students here at the Institute, became great friends and colleagues, started to publish work with them, and I want to thank Diego Santori and Ian Magimsi, my fellow sociologists, for our great conversations about policy and the publications that resulted. And I also want to thank Tristan McCowan, who introduced me to his colleagues at Roehampton University, getting me my first job there as a visiting lecturer, which led to me getting a job there for 2 years towards the end of my PhD. So I finished my doctorate in 2011. By then I was working at Roehampton, and I had many great colleagues. I made good friends with Kate Hoskins, with whom I still work today, as well as many others who have since made the transition back to the Institute. My move back to the IOE began in 2012. I was actually on my honeymoon. I got an email from Stephen Ball saying there were jobs coming up at the IOE and maybe I'd be interested in applying. Dave and Deborah had by this point been poached by Birmingham. IOE needed people to teach the race module and the new BA in Education Studies. So the IOE actually lost my application, but I very nearly missed out on this job, which I desperately wanted. But with Carol's help, I actually ended up getting an interview and getting a job and starting work in the autumn of 2012 as a lecturer, and I have been here ever since. So since then, I have worked with many great colleagues in the EPS department and the Centre of Sociology of Education and Equity, Louise Archer, who has been a great research mentor, Stephen Ball, of course, Jessica Ringrose, Annette Braun, Patrick Bailey, and Bronwyn Jones, to mention a few. I taught the race module for 8 years. I led the MA in social justice and education. And during this period, I also undertook a number of research projects, including several with my colleague Guy Roberts-Holmes, and during COVID, several projects with Gemma Moss. And I'm grateful to all of these colleagues for all of our conversations and the way they have forced me to think really critically about education. In 2019, my work changed again when I was appointed the co-director of the Helen Hamlin Centre for Pedagogy, alongside the founding director, Dominic Wise. And I want to say a huge thank you to Dom for all his support in this role. Having this responsibility in HHCP gives me time to focus on research in a way that I've never really been able to do before. And being part of the centre allows me to get involved in many, many interesting projects. So thank you also to the rest of the HHCP team for all their work and support, which makes a huge difference to my working life, and of course to the Helen Hamlin Trust, who generously fund our research centre. More recently, I've done work with colleagues such as Jane Perryman on Ofsted reform, and it's been great to be part of the Beyond Ofsted research team. I've also been working with Sharon Vince on projects exploring food banks in schools and early years, and again, I'm going to come back to all of this in a moment. And it's great that I keep finding people I can work with across the Institute. I should also mention there have been so many other people whose small acts of kindness go towards building an academic career, the people who help find me schools for fieldwork, of course, all the participants in my research. They are all, part of the journey. So my role these days is focused on the HHCP and my doctoral students, and it's to them that I want to say a final thank you. I've learned so much from my many PhD students, both past and present. Their research challenges me and inspires me and gives me faith that our field of the sociology of education is thriving. And I do try to prioritise working with them because I know what a difference it can make to people's academic careers. So I'm sure I've forgotten people, I apologise, but with 3 children and the associated sleep deprivation, my memory is not what it used to be. So I was awarded my professorship in 2021. So here we are in 2025, and for those of us familiar with the workings of the Institute, that's pretty good going, really. No, I am joking. There's obviously a COVID backlog. I am immensely grateful to the IOE for giving me a job that I love and allowing me to progress through the ranks to become a professor, right from the start of my MA till now. My connection to the IOE is obviously a very strong one. In fact, I'm not the first of the Bradburys to attend the IOE, but the third. My sister came here to do a PGCE and an MA before me, and in fact, my father came here to do a PGCE back in 1967. So I am delighted to be the first Professor Bradbury, even if my children think that means I teach at Hogwarts. So I come now to the main part of my lecture, which I'm going to talk about my work. Lynn has already done quite a good job of summarising much of it. I'm going to do it in much more length. And I hope, I've sort of picked bits which you find, which I think are interesting, and I hope you find interesting too, and relevant, particularly to today's education system. I chose the title and the theme of the lecture to try to kind of sum up what I do, which is not easy, which is to focus on schools and policy and inequality. And I realised recently that my MA dissertation actually was on ability, policy and inequality, which is actually very similar to my 2021 book and the title of this lecture. So that either proves that I'm quite consistent in my interests, or maybe that I'm just still banging on about the same things 20 years later. So when you apply to become a professor, you fill in this statement about your achievements, and I showed my draft of this list of projects to my colleague, Gemma Moss, and she said in her inimitable style, no, this is all wrong. You need to explain your intellectual project. And I thought, I didn't know I had one of those, but apparently I do. And she then reeled off what it was, and I tried to write it down. But actually, it was very good preparation for today to make me think, what joins everything together? So I have it in a Venn diagram. At the heart of my work is this question about practice and pedagogy, how it's influenced by policy, and what this means for inequalities. So my work is sort of usually in the middle of these circles, or somewhere in the overlaps. And I've put primary and early years together, but obviously they are in many ways very different. I started doing research in reception, and that's kind of allowed me to go in both directions. So some of the projects which I've done might seem sort of slightly tangential to the main focus, like on reading policy or on the experiences of minority teachers, for example, but they are somewhere always within these 3 circles, I think. So I'm going to highlight some key concepts from my research and why I think what happens in schools matters and how it relates to inequalities. And I'm making the argument really that we need to understand policy, both in and of itself, and I have done work which kind of looks purely at policy, but also we need to understand how it's enacted in schools and what the kind of unintended consequences it might have. And I come to this not from a position of kind of wanting to find out what awful things schools are doing now, but I think from my background as a teacher, from far more from a kind of point of view where I'm interested in pedagogy and practice as being shaped by society as well as by policy and other kind of social factors. So understanding what teachers do, to put it simply, matters because it's vital to understanding how children experience school and how schools can perpetuate inequalities. And it's this issue, which is the relationship between schools and the reproduction of inequality, which lies at the heart of my field of the sociology of education. So instead of going through project by project, I'm going to go through these 6 concepts. I'm going to move about between different research projects, though there is a slightly chronological pattern. I'm not going to go into lots of detail about my every project, but if you're interested, you can always, of course, read more in my books and papers. This is very much a kind of greatest hits approach rather than a kind of comprehensive discography. So I'm going to begin with cynical compliance, which I describe as a tokenistic, half-hearted and tactical adherence of some teachers to the requirements of assessment, for example, or policy, undertaken in a situation where teachers feel they have very little power to resist. And this is drawn from Stephen Ball's work, where he used this term to describe the performance required by school inspections. He says, what is produced is a spectacle, game-playing, or cynical compliance. And I have taken this phrase and used it in relation to assessment, particularly to explore situations where there are high stakes and teachers are under pressure, so they will always find a way to get through the system, whether they believe in it or not. And what is produced is I argue, is a fabrication, again, a term from Ball's work, a set of numbers often which presents a fabricated reality distant from the reality of the classroom, but which has the power to judge the children, the teacher, and the school. So I use this term in my PhD research. It involved me sitting in 2 reception classrooms in London for over a year. One thing I realised quite quickly is that 4- and 5-year-old children do not understand the idea of non-participant observation. So while I was doing up their coats and sharpening pencils, I was also attempting to understand how practice was being affected by a new assessment that had been introduced in the 2000s. And it looks like this. This is the early years foundation stage profile. It has 117 different statements across the entirety of the curriculum. And at this point, because it did change later, the assessment required teachers to assess every child on every point, and collect evidence in the form of pictures and post-it notes, creating a huge new burden for reception teachers, which was pretty much paper-based at this point, and later became digitized. And when I interviewed teachers about doing this, their approach and responses demonstrated what I described as cynical compliance. So this is Jim, who's the reception teacher, talking about when they were moderated. Basically, he was told, these are 2 schools in inner city London, but he was told that his results were too high. They shouldn't be scoring that high according to the government figures. And this is Lynn, who's another early years teacher, and she's saying, if people keep saying to you, that's not right, no, that's not right, that's not right, I don't want you to mark them into a curve, I don't want you to fit them into a pigeonhole, I want you to mark them how you think you mark them. And then you get told off for that. Well, then you think, well, you just get to the point where you think, I'm just going to fill this out. What do you think I should write? So you will stop bothering me, please. So the key point of this quote really is that the process becomes really detached from reality, and the point becomes just to fill out the forms rather than to accurately assess the children. And obviously this relates to the point about, of being the moderation at this process at this school. They were told their results were too high for them as an inner city school, and as a result, as Jim says here, he says, I was not told to change any of the figures in a way that suggests that he was very much told to change the figures. There was this question arose about how a school with a very difficult intake could achieve 0.5% average. How could it be average? So they're not even allowed to be average. That must be wrong. And so he ends up changing the results. This idea of cynical compliance continues to be relevant, and we've found it in the research recently on Ofsted. on the Beyond Ofsted inquiry, which was about school inspections. The work needed between inspections in order to produce this spectacle of the good or outstanding school has many kind of commonalities with this attitude of my reception teachers. We do it because we have to, not because it helps the children or makes us better teachers. And in fact, we found 70% of teachers doing training on what Ofsted wants. Work done purely for the sake of Ofsted rather than for the purpose of children's learning. And this is a quote from one of our focus group teachers who talks about paperwork that you have to fill in for no other reason than the fact that Ofsted might want to look at it. And then the rest of the quote goes on to explain how the school, the Ofsted say, no, we don't need to look at your planning. The school says, no, you still have to do it because they might want to look at it. The school basically has this kind of really almost paranoid, even if Ofsted say they don't need it, the school believes that they may still ask for every teacher's planning. So Ofsted become, just like with the EYFSP, they become part of a game that teachers are forced to play, which they are doing while trying to maintain as much autonomy and freedom as possible. And this need to play the game obviously produces tactical practices, which we might phrase as fabrications and gaming. These quotes, which are from my reception teacher, this is Jim, who was also talking about how when his results came up too high, there was a real problem because the Key Stage 1 SATs results in the school had come out as quite low, and he was worried, as he says, if you were to chart it on a graph, it would show that the children have achieved or they've gone backwards. So this problem of kind of needing to measure progress, there's a real advantage in keeping those early years scores low so that you can maximise how much progress you show. And this is exactly what we found in our research on baseline, another reception assessment, where schools were wanting to keep their baseline scores low in order to maximise the progress. And I'll come back to baseline in a moment. So continuing on this theme about thinking about policy and practice and priorities, I want to talk next about datafication. So here I'm talking about a datafied education system as a kind of data-obsessed school, or a system which prioritises data as one governed by a specific rationality where numbers become the means through which we understand worth. And this is something that I wrote a lot about with Guy in the mid to late 2010s when data became more important. It became mainly digitised and Ofsted were really prioritising data. So I was already interested in the volume of data being produced in early years when in 2015 the Conservative government introduced a new assessment into reception, baseline. This is an assessment which was so, to use a technical term, bonkers, that researching it proved surprisingly fruitful and significant. So they decided, presumably without talking to anyone who had ever met a 4-year-old, that they would introduce a test at the beginning of reception so that this data could be compared with the Year 6 SATs at the end of primary education. 3 different companies were given the task of producing this assessment just to make it even less reliable. And they all had to do this assessment in the first 6 weeks, which really was intended so that it would produce data which wasn't useful for the school, that would be black boxed or hidden away until the children were 11. And I was asked by the NUT and the ATL, the teachers' unions, to research this assessment. And with Guy, we explored this policy with teachers through interviews and a survey. And we found that baseline was a total mess. It was very, very unpopular. And teachers found it really disrupted that first few weeks. And this is one of my favourite quotes about a head teacher talking about, you've got 60 young people coming in through the door, you've got to tick 47 boxes. That was one of the better assessments, was only 47 boxes. Your mind is going to be on that rather than talking to them about their nice shiny shoes and their pet rabbit at home and all the things that give them a secure start. In fact, the policy, that's our report, the policy was such a mess that it was actually abandoned in early 2016. And Guy and I actually won the BERA Impact Prize for our work highlighting the problems with baseline. And from this research and the extra research we'd done in early years, we wrote a book on datafication, focusing on this shift towards data within education more widely. And that work remains, I think, an important part of my kind of contribution. It builds on the work of Ball on performativity, but it recognises this shifting role of numerical data in a time where there were technological advances that shaped practice, but also this immense pressure from Ofsted to produce the right data. And we argued in this book, as you can say here, various things about datafication being productive of particular subjectivities, but also being reductive, reducing children to numbers or as data doppelgangers. And I remain really interested in this idea of data as becoming part of increased visibility, visibility of performance, and a key part of performativity. Just to show you the extent of datafication, I'm going to just illustrate kind of the obsession of the time with collecting numerical data and measuring everything. This is just to show you the kind of scene you'd see in a lot of nurseries where a practitioner would be taking photos with an iPad and allocating that observation to various developmental milestones. And I'm going to show you some example from one of my own children, because that's easy to get parental permission. This is an example. This is my middle daughter, Jasmine. She's about 18 months. She's doing something with paint and dinosaurs. And the description at the bottom says about what she's doing with it and how she says there's yellow. She's making lines on the dinosaur. She was talking about using the brush to paint the feet and walking them along. This is a kind of normal, everyday thing that happens in a nursery, but it's being photographed. I've got 3 photos of it, got a whole little description. And then underneath this, and this is further down, we get this labeling of what she's doing as being, she's showing 2 of the characteristics of effective learning. And then we get this judgment of her against various points on the early years foundation stage. So she is developing at making connections. She's secure at using single words. She's only commencing, unfortunately, expressing her own preferences and interests. She's only developing at playing alongside others. And those numbers there are the number of months which show that she is being judged against what she should be doing in that age band in terms of months. And this is the kind of extremes of datafication which we are really interested in. And just for fun, I am going to show you one more because it's quite funny. This is Jasmine when she was even littler. She's about 10 months. She's just started nursery. And the practitioner has taken 3 photos and said, Jasmine is sitting with me in the cozy area. I hold Jasmine, I give her a bottle. Jasmine takes the milk bottle out of her mouth. She removes the bottle from my hand and holds the milk bottle with her both hands. And she feeds herself the rest of her milk. And she is labelled as having a can-do attitude. Well done, Jasmine, for wanting the milk. Interestingly, if you know Jasmine, she does have a can-do attitude, but I think that's just one of the most sort of extreme versions of the kind of thing which we saw. Underneath it, so she, interestingly though, is only developing holding her own bottle or cup. So all of this data is feeding into a spreadsheet somewhere which says, yes, she's reaching things, and yes, no, she's not. Is she meeting her milestones? It's all producing the kind of data which we think, as we've discussed in our book about datafication, as having kind of power to shape the individual identity. I did go on to write more about datafication, and I've written about the 5 Ps of datafication, which is my way of trying to emphasize that it's not just about pedagogy and practice, it's not just about having numbers, it's also about having an impact on subjectivities of different people, different identities that we are shaped through data. So really it's subjectivities, but that doesn't begin with P. So I have to have people, and then I'm also really interested in power, which I think is shown by some of the data, particularly in relation to Ofsted. So when we were talking to schools about data, they said things like this. They say, if you get you're only as good as your last year's results, get the data right, and you buy yourself 5 years of freedom. That's 5 years of freedom from another Ofsted inspection. So this is the kind of power of data to really change not just priorities, but also to constitute success. So following on from that work on datafication, Guy and I did a follow-up project on grouping children funded by the NEU. And we were interested in how different policies were encouraging practices of grouping by ability. And more I felt like my research was building this case that pedagogy and practice were being kind of unduly influenced by assessment, that the assessment tail was wagging the pedagogy dog, as it were. And this is a particular issue because we already know that systems such as grouping by ability tend to disadvantage those already disadvantaged, for example, those from poorer backgrounds and from minority groups. And I want to highlight 2 quotes from that work which show the real impact on children from grouping systems, which themselves arise from the kind of intense pressure associated with assessment. So the first one here is a school where they were having a vote on whether they should carry on streaming. Previously, they had put children into classes for the entire year based on their ability, and they had a vote amongst the teaching staff, and this teacher explains to us they voted no. They felt that the ones in the bottom group, who were there for the whole year, were thinking, I'm failing, I'm in the lower group, I'm stuck here, I might as well not try. So in fact, they moved away from that kind of streaming. And the one below is this really sad story of a girl who was in the top set in Key Stage 2, this is, and she said that she got moved to the middle set, and she said, well, I used to want to be a doctor like my mum, but since I moved to the middle set, I've realised that's not something I can do. So I'm not good enough. So I'm thinking about what else I might do in the future. So this is the kind of really real human cost of these kind of grouping practices. And I'm absolutely delighted that Laura Quick, who was one of my PhD students, has work on this, which kind of continues where my work leaves off, really, by focusing on children's experiences. So I continue to be interested in these kind of dividing practices, a term I use based on Foucault. In 2019, I did a study on head teachers' views of SATs, and we found that setting was very prevalent because of the pressure of SATs, just like I had found in the earlier Key Stage 1 project on with the phonics screening check. It was seen, however, as a kind of necessary evil. And with Laura and Annette Braun, we also wrote about the kind of intervention groups, the setting and streaming associated with SATs, and we conceptualized these as micro-practices of power. And I continue to be kind of really interested in how these operate within schools. The other thing that comes up again and again within the kind of grouping discussion is the issue of triage, which I had recognized when I studied it originally on my MA as being exactly what we were doing in Year 6. So triage is the prioritization of children who are going to make the most difference. And this arises from Gilbert and Udell in 2000. I remember seeing this on my MA and thinking, yeah, this is what I'm doing every day. Basically, the triage model suggests that you work on the people who are going to make a big difference. Some people are definitely safe and you're definitely going to pass, so you don't worry about them. And some people aren't going to pass, however much you do, so they end up being the hopeless case group. And I've seen this throughout all of my work on practice, and particularly in relation to assessment. This is a teacher talking about in Year 1 with the phonics screening check. She was brought in a panic, bringing grouping in because of this panic. Everybody was in with the teacher, although it was differentiated, and I took, that's the teacher saying, they must get these children to pass their phonics check group. And I say, oh, the children who, like with a push, and she says, yes. So obviously the children that they just went, well, those ones aren't going to make it, so they're in the class doing something differentiated. And then there's a bulk going, yes, these ones are going to be fine. And then there's the other ones, they were like, these have got to do it, otherwise our score is going to be awful. So this extra teacher is brought in to teach those children, which is a kind of rationing of education. We also see it in early years. This is a local authority advisor talking about who's going to get the good level of development. And he says, they're easily going to make it, thank you very much. They're never going to make it, so go over there and have a nice time. And we look to the middle group. And he says it's like year 6 SAT, and it's a very unfair system. And again, you see this sort of tension between people saying, I have to do this, this is a necessary evil, I've got to do it to get my results to be high, but I don't really want to. And actually, we found it recently in work that I did with Laura on the SATs effect. A teacher said, I've been told to forget children. They're the ones that aren't going to make any difference to the statistics. We also found, interestingly, a kind of double triage system happening in Year 6, where schools were really pushing those children who might get the kind of higher standard of greater depth as well. We had this kind of double triage. And I think this really kind of emphasizes how responsive schools are to the policy and the power of assessment to change pedagogy. And that is why policy, I would argue, matters so much, because it really does change what people what people do. So because of all this work, with Dominic Wise, I co-chaired this Independent Commission on Assessment in Primary Education, ICAPE. We did a lot of work coming up with a kind of credible plan for how assessment might be changed, the phasing out of various assessments, the reduction in high stakes, various things to try and kind of influence the government and kind of hope for a slightly a different system. And obviously we really await the outcomes of the curriculum and assessment review with interest, if not too much optimism at present. So I have 3 more concepts which are shorter, you're glad to know. The next one is the difficult intake discourse, and this is a phrase that you will have seen earlier in some of the quotes, and this really symbolises the kind of power issue of low expectations, and particularly the operation of an idealised, often white middle class norm. And these are just some quotes, again from my reception teachers, from my PhD, talking about this kind of mystical other children in some other school who are middle class English parents, who are supportive and so on, and really comparing that with the children that they have in their own school. And that leads to only really those kind of low results becoming intelligible. And again, we saw similar things in a lot of the datification research, talking about, interestingly, about brains, which I will come back to. And this leads me, this kind of difficult intake discourse and how it links to inequality leads me into my 5th one, which is the concept of ability. So I have been writing and thinking about ability for quite a long time. And then when we did the grouping project, we had over 1,300 responses to a survey question, which said, how do you understand the term ability? So I analysed all of those and put them in basically into these 3 different boxes. These are primary teachers. And so the main kind of tendencies within their descriptions or definitions of ability were to talk about it as something innate or as something positional. And there were a few who talked about it as some other things. And this really kind of sparked my interest in thinking about ability and led to me really further kind of interrogating how intertwined ability and inequality are, and how they can become reinvigorated, I argue, by recent developments. So these 2 discourses, which you can see the kind of examples here of the kind of innate discourse, where it's ability is something within you that is fixed, and then positional, where it's something sort of comparative. Those 2 different kind of discourses, which don't always work together, they relate to 2 particular developments, I argue, within education. The first one is, I link it to neuroscience, the ability is innate. This is a report, an infamous report from 2011, of where they used this photo of normal and extreme neglect babies, 3-year-old children's brains to then make conclusions about how we need to assume differences, a very kind of deterministic discourse about how we treat children who are living in poverty, for example. And this is just a kind of example, really, of the way in which the spectre of the brain, as people say, has kind of imposed itself within ideas of development and early years education. And basically, I argue that ability and neuroscience become these kind of reinforcing, deterministic ideas about children based on their backgrounds. The other side, the ability as positional, I argue links to datification. So data works to represent children in comparison with others or relation to a norm. And I argue both are obviously highly important in establishing and maintaining and reinforcing patterns of inequality. This is an illustration of how you, what you get in your Year 6 SATs is used to predict what you're going to get in your GCSE. So you get this particular flight path where you're expected to make this patterns of progress, which is very much a kind of datafied way of understanding learning. So I'm interested in this idea about ability and how it relates to inequality and how it works through practices such as grouping. And Archer talks about setting can be interpreted as a technology of social reproduction, which reflects the interests of the privileged. And this relates to ideas about the neoliberal myth of meritocracy and how it works as a myth which obscures inequalities. So, we're almost there. Lastly, I want to talk about responsibilization. Now, that book, An Ability, was written just before and during the COVID pandemic. Of course, COVID changed a lot of things, and my research focus very much shifted very suddenly onto how schools were coping. With the projects that were mentioned at the beginning, with Gemma Moss, which we did kind of very early in 2020, we found over and over that schools were prioritising food and safety and welfare. And basically this really revealed how depleted the welfare state had become and how schools were really stepping into that role of providing for students. So this is a teacher who is basically delivering food. What we found was more and more the concerns about lost learning were basically a privilege. If you were worrying about lost learning, it was a privilege because some schools were worrying about who was safe and who was hungry. And the schools that we spoke to in all of our case studies were doing an incredible amount to support their local families. However, this isn't recognised. They have become responsibilised, but with no recognition. Amanda Spielman, the former lead for Ofsted, said that schools put food parcels before education, and she was critical of that. Then, of course, came the cost of living crisis post-COVID. We found in our COVID projects that the schools were really kind of bearing the brunt, but also that the entire experience had exposed this kind of impact of poverty. Not just hungry children and the schools feeding them, but also the fact that there were all of these other services which had really become so depleted. And as this teacher says, you just have to work it out for yourselves. This led me into thinking more about this work that schools were doing. And with my colleague Sharon Vince, I undertook 2 projects on food banks in schools and in nurseries. And again, this is the issue of schools becoming responsible. The teachers over and over would say things like, someone's got to do it, haven't they? They have hungry children, they're on the front line, and they see them every day, and somebody has to do it. And as the head on the second quote here talks about, it isn't just about food, it's also about housing. It's also about when the school is closed because of a strike, that the children weren't going to be warm. And there is this huge tension for many of the educational practitioners at all levels between doing this work and then doing what they see as the kind of key educational work that they're used to. She says, we know what we have to help children read and write, and that's what we signed up for, and we're really good at that, but we're doing other things because we have to. With that work, I think what's so interesting for me is that it's not actually about a policy being put into schools. That's how it's very different. In fact, it's about a kind of absence of policy, a policy void or a policy vacuum, where schools don't know how to deal with rising child poverty and rising food insecurity, and they're basically finding a way themselves to do it based on their kind of ethics of care. And so this, for example, Sasha here, who's a head teacher, talks about being humans and our natural instinct is to care. It's a caring profession, where being a teacher is now far more than just education. So that is the book that came out just a few weeks ago. So I've had these kind of 6 key concepts which run through my work. And I think if I'm going to kind of sum up and conclude this main part, I really want to emphasize that this task of understanding policy and practice is never complete, but it is a really necessary task if we want to move towards a fairer system. As I've written here, I think there's incredible complexity in how schools enact policy, and there are kind of constantly evolving different ways to understand it. But it remains, I would argue, a key kind of part of our field of the sociology of education to really understand the impact of policy. So thinking into the future, where does this leave us? Well, I continue to be interested in many of the same issues. We get different questions when we get different policy. I'm currently working on how we influence the curriculum and assessment review and the Ofsted consultation. And one thing actually I haven't focused on very much this evening is my work with More Than a Score and the NEU and the political kind of work, which really tries to shape the education sector for the better, not always with much success. But I do hope that the new government is going to listen to this research, which I think has shown really how damaging a system dominated by accountability can be for teachers and for children, and the need to recognise the work that schools do to help children in poverty. So on a more kind of personal note, to end the lecture, I want to say very much thank you to my friends and family for all their support over the years. I started my story in the middle earlier, so now it's time to go back to the beginning and tell you about my school life. And it is becoming a bit of a tradition to put up a photo of you at school in a professorial lecture, so I won't disappoint you. I am here in the middle. This is me. I'm the tall one. My dad cut my hair at the time, which I think you can tell. I'm very happy. I'm in school in northwest London in 1985, this is in fact it's interesting. I started school. I already knew how to read quite a lot of words. One of my earliest memories is my dad making me try to read headlines in The Guardian. Obviously, we indoctrinate our children quite early in North London. I loved school right from the beginning. I was always kind of one of the oldest in the year, and I think that kind of wonderful primary education experience is probably why I remain really interested in primary education. So I lived with my dad and my sister in a home where we weren't rich, but we were rich in books because my dad was a book editor, and I'm really grateful that I grew up in a family where learning was encouraged and valued. My older sister went through school before me. I was always being asked, "Are you Katie Bradbury's sister?" And it was always a good thing. And I'm very grateful to her for paving the way, all the way from first school to middle school to our comprehensive secondary school and the FE college where we did our A-levels. I then went on to Cambridge and into teaching, just like Katie did, though she has stuck it out for a lot longer than me. And now her insights as a primary head teacher are obviously very useful in my work. I'm also very grateful, obviously, to my mum, who is at home with my children tonight, but has offered so much help over the last 11 years, and of course to my parents-in-law, who have so helpful when the children were very little. To my dad, who brought us up as a single parent, I want to say the biggest thank you, obviously, for encouraging me and teaching me everything, including teaching me to value education and fairness, because that is very much a large part of who I am today. I want you to join me in giving my dad a round of applause. And finally, before I get too emotional, I want to thank my husband, Alistair, for his support. We actually met via a friend on the MA. So the Institute has not only given me a career, but also a husband. He has been there through all the various phases of my career, supporting me. And finally, however, this really is finally, there are, of course, 3 other people who are the most important people in my life. I couldn't resist a photo. These are my 3 daughters, Amber, Jasmine, and Lily, all been born since I have been working here at the Institute, and I've learned so much from them about education, about what it's like to be a child in school today, and they are my absolute pride and joy. So thank you all very much for listening.
Well, Alice, what can I say? I mean, I think we all agree, it's been an absolutely thought-provoking, captivating and inspiring lecture. So thank you very much, Alice, for sharing that personal and also inspiring career journey with us. Now, it is tradition in these professorial lectures that we do have a respondent, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Carol Vincent this evening as Emeritus Professor of Sociology of Education at UCL IOE, to be this evening's respondent in responding to Alice's lecture. Now, Carol's interest is in education policy, and looking really in depth at how individuals and states respond to social ethnic diversity and how families' relationship with the education system is absolutely shaped by social class and ethnicity. You can see how that aligns really well with our lecture tonight. In 2019, I should say, and I love the title of this book, Carol published a book called Tea and the Queen, Fundamental British Values, Schools and Citizenship. And I think it's a really seminal book that raises important questions and debates about those important issues of citizenship, diversity, social class, and really provoking our readers to think very deeply about how these issues are enacted and also impacted on teachers in their everyday lives in school. So on that note, Carol, I'm really delighted to invite you to share a short response to the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I have made the rookie error of printing out what I was going to say on single space. So you'll have to forgive me if I squint at my piece of paper a bit. 25 years of presenting here, and I've forgotten it all in the 18 months I've been away. I'm delighted to be here today, I really am, and to respond to Alice's insightful, thoughtful, and beautifully expressed professorial lecture. I've known Alice for a number of years as friend and colleague, and as an excellent sociologist and public intellectual. In academic terms, Alice has had an impressive trajectory, as we've just heard. Her research has had a broad but coherent scope as her themes identify across sociology and social policy. I understand Alice's work to date as a careful and clear identification of how the current English school system reproduces existing inequalities. Speaking with Stephen Ball recently, Stephen was initially one of Alice's PhD examiners and then a colleague. He likened Alice to somebody like Jean Flood, a pioneering sociologist of education who also worked at IOE. While using different methods, Flood was firmly in the British political arithmetic tradition, and Alice is a policy sociologist. They both address the relations between policy and inequality. Alice uses contemporary iterations of social theory, but retains a classic sociological emphasis on the mechanics of class and its intersections with other dimensions, especially race. She focuses on inequality, how inequality is produced, manifested, and experienced in classrooms, how policy constitutes a framework within which practitioners think and act, and in the Foucauldian sense, how policy brings particular understandings and interpretations to bear upon the student and the teacher. Alice differs from someone like Jean Flood, in my view, as Alice focuses also on the politics of education policy. Indeed, I think she pulls off the extremely difficult balancing act of producing work that is both theoretically informed and policy relevant. We can see the intellectual engagement with theory in her use of both Foucault and critical race theory. When in interrogating policy discourses of ability, datification and dividing practices. In her work in food banks in schools, influenced by Foucault's concept of governmentality, from which is derived ideas of responsibilization. In her application and further development of Gilborn and Udell's concept of triage. And in her interrogating common sense and very powerful ideas of meritocracy and ability that allow the social and economic privileges that define educational success to be read as inherent ability. Her policy-focused work includes her work with the Teachers' Trade Union, the NEU, and the campaigning group More Than a Score, and her recent work on food banks. She is also one of the only two academics I know that enjoys writing. The rest of us sweat over it, avoid it, agonize over it. That might be just me, but hopefully not. Alice, however, writes fluently, incisively, and productively. I also want to make a point that we all know, but sometimes get forgotten in arenas like this. Maintaining a balance between paid work and caring responsibilities is hard and brings a heavy physical and emotional load. This is particularly so for parenting in the contemporary moment, when anxieties around the social, economic and physical conditions that our children will inherit intensifies demands on parents, demands that are further increased when social media showers us with parenting advice and Instagram accounts of happy families. Indeed, in August last year, the US Surgeon General issued a public health advisory, arguing that while parenting lights up lives, the physical and emotional load of parenting can be a risk to parents' well-being. So I think it's important to also highlight that, as Alice said at the end, that her successes as an academic have been largely achieved while she and Alistair have been bringing up Amber, Jasmine and Lily. In my last couple of minutes, I'm going to make a few observations on Alice's most recent two books, Ability, Inequality in Post-Pandemic Schools and Food Banks in Schools, the latter co-authored with Sharon Vince. The former, Ability, Inequality in Post-Pandemic Schools, is described as a genealogy of the rules and regulations that drive ability in the present time. In it, Alice powerfully interrogates the classificatory systems in operation in schools and what has been called the neural turn in education. In particular, our confused use and understanding of the term ability, used despite our confusion, and as Alice has showed you, as a powerful and pervasive justification for practice. The book challenges and seeks to unmake common sense ideas about ability and how they constitute contemporary pedagogical regimes. Neuroscience, especially in its translation to education policy, has, as Alice has argued, the potential to biologize our conceptions of the child and their educational and social trajectory. She identifies policies here and abroad that are underpinned by conceptions of ability as innate and measurable, but that also, in a complex combination of ideas around fixedness and plasticity, it is poorer children's brains that are often portrayed as not being properly developed by their parents, ramping up further pressure on parents and overlooking social inequalities which shape the conditions for raising children. This understanding leads to what Zimbalist and others refers to as neuroliberal governance, a form of governance that projects behavioural interventions as a leading strategy for addressing social issues at the expense of socio-structural reforms. So in that book, Alice was concerned to address what form of education children should have and to highlight how teaching is led and shaped by assessment. Her recent book with Sharon Vince is on food banks and addresses the issue of what can and should be the purpose of a primary school. Their research reveals the shaming situation that in the world's sixth largest economy, too many primary schools are providing food for their children and families. As Alice said, staff see the provision of food banks as necessary, something they shouldn't have to provide or organise, but they do in order to respond for local need and care for the children that they teach. Yet, as Sharon and Alice argue, food banks exist in a policy vacuum. Ofsted are interested in reading results, not the provision of food, and schools are reliant on individual inspectors seeing the link between those two things. One head teacher quoted in the book suggests schools as community centres with GP services, benefits and employment services, children's activities, all being available on the one site. Might sound familiar. We saw that happen, of course, with Sure Start, albeit with problems and limitations. But resurrecting such centres would require the state, beyond individual state school institutions, to step back into the space from which it has withdrawn, to adopt the ethics of care for those living in poverty, the care that the nursery participants in the research demonstrate. I believe we underestimate the capacity of our primary schools if we see them as places to just teach children the basics. For example, I've argued in previous research that in areas with diverse populations, they provide a space for parents of children with different social class and ethnic backgrounds to meet, with the potential to develop sustained connections across difference. And as Alice and Sharon argue, they have the potential to provide kids with a safe and inclusive space and help those families struggling to provide a different kind of basics. There are some promising indicators. The Secretary of State for Education, Bridget Phillipson, talked last November about the importance of children feeling a sense of belonging and well-being in schools, and the key role that teachers play in creating that. Schools, she said, are the beating heart of their communities, and a sole focus on achievement is doomed to fail. The government has also announced last week the first 750 primary schools to offer free breakfast clubs. Although there are concerns about the limited funding, this is perhaps an indicator, and we need some optimism at the moment, I think, that the government understands that schools, especially primary schools, can and should be at the centre of their local communities. However, a heavy assessment load, a limited curriculum, austerity budgets and the stressed staff of many schools will not, as Alice has so ably pointed out, help primary schools or their students to fulfil their potential. Hopefully we'll see more recognition of this in Ofsted, the government and DFE in the next few years. And I know that Alice and other colleagues in this room will be at the forefront of arguing for that recognition. And with that in mind, my final observation this evening is that as I head towards the winding down of my own career as a sociologist of education, I welcome the thought that the discipline is in the hands of someone as capable and committed as Alice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. I was about to say some concluding remarks, but you know what? I don't think I can even top that. You know what? I think I agree. Everyone would agree with me. This has been an absolutely fascinating and really wonderful event. Thank you so much, Carol. And please do join me and join everyone for a glass of wine and some nibbles at the end. Thank you very much, Alice. Thank you.